The fire started just before dawn, orange flames tearing through metal, smoke rising over the quiet town. Neighbors peeked from their windows, phones in hand, but no one moved. It wasn't just any garage burning, it belonged to the Hells Angels. People whispered, "They deserve it." Not one hand lifted a hose, not one voice called for help. As the roof cracked and the walls glowed red, an old black man stood at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't part of them. He had nothing to prove, no reason to get involved. Yet, something in his eyes said otherwise. While others stepped back, he stepped forward, into the heat, into the danger, into the silence that no one else dared to break. No one knew his name. No one expected what he was about to do. But in that moment, when hate met courage, everything changed. What makes a man walk into fire, when everyone else walks away? Before that night, the old man was just another quiet face in the neighborhood, someone most people barely noticed. His name was Elias Turner, though few ever called him by name. He lived at the edge of town, in a small wooden house that had seen better days, surrounded by old tools, memories, and silence. Every morning, Elias would walk to the corner store, nod politely to strangers who rarely nodded back, and return home with a bag of groceries that never cost more than a few dollars. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. But there was something about him, a calm strength, an unspoken patience that came from years of surviving things most people couldn't even imagine. Decades ago, Elias had worked as a mechanic. He knew engines better than people. He could fix anything that had a pulse of steel and fire. Back in the day, his small workshop was a place where anyone could come, black, white, biker, soldier, or stranger, and he'd help without asking questions. But that was years ago. Time had taken his shop, his family, and most of his health. What it hadn't taken was his sense of right and wrong. In a town like this, where lines were drawn and quietly enforced, that made him different. And being different meant being invisible, until something went wrong. The Hells Angels chapter in that small town wasn't like the stories people imagined. They weren't outlaws roaring through streets every night. They were older now, quieter. They had a garage by the highway where they repaired bikes and cars for anyone who needed help. For years, Elias had passed by that same garage on his way to the store. He never went in, but he always noticed the laughter, the smell of oil and smoke, the sound of music from an old radio. People in town kept their distance. "Don't get mixed up with them bikers," they'd say. "They've got their own rules." Elias never judged. He'd lived long enough to know what judgment could do to a man's life. But beneath the town's calm surface, something had been brewing. There were whispers, quiet, ugly whispers. About how those bikers didn't belong, how they brought trouble, how their kind of people weren't like us. It wasn't about motorcycles. It was about skin color, pride, and history that no one wanted to talk about out loud. Elias had seen that story before. In the South, in the cities, even in his own family's past, fires always started the same way, not with matches, but with hate. On the day before the fire, the air already felt heavy. The town's power had gone out for a few hours, and most people blamed the biker garage for overloading something. No one asked for proof. They didn't need it. Rumors were enough to make people turn their eyes and close their hearts. Elias, as usual, spent that evening sitting on his porch, sipping weak coffee as the sun dipped below the hills. He could hear the faint sound of laughter coming from the direction of the garage, the rumble of an engine being tested, someone clapping, the music of people just trying to live. And then he heard something else, a distant shout, maybe anger, maybe warning. He didn't know then what it meant. The next morning, the smell of smoke reached his house before the sound of sirens ever did. He looked up and saw a cloud rising, thick, black, angry. He knew exactly where it was coming from. The biker garage. By the time Elias reached the street, people were already gathered. Some watched with curiosity, some with satisfaction, and some with fear. The fire danced high, devouring everything it touched. Metal screamed as it bent, and explosions echoed as gas tanks ignited. And yet, no one helped. The fire trucks were on their way, but no one was holding a hose. The neighbors stood back, phones out, whispering about karma, about getting what they deserved. Someone laughed. Another said it was better this way. Elias just stood there, silent. He could feel something tightening in his chest, not from the smoke, but from what he was witnessing. The same silence, the same indifference he'd seen decades ago when a fire had taken something from him, too. He remembered the faces that looked away back then. The faces that had decided his pain wasn't their problem. And now he was watching history repeat itself, only this time, he wasn't the victim. He could have walked away. He was old. His knees hurt. His lungs weren't what they used to be. But something deep inside him, something heavy and human, wouldn't let him move backward. He didn't know those men inside. He didn't care what patches they wore. All he knew was that people were burning, and the world was watching. Elias dropped his coffee mug and started walking toward the flames. Each step was slow, heavy, deliberate, not just through smoke, but through decades of memories and ghosts. The crowd shifted, murmuring in disbelief. "Where's he going?" someone said. "Leave it, old man," another voice shouted. But Elias didn't stop. Because for him, this wasn't just a burning building. It was a test, one life's worth of quiet endurance facing one moment of impossible choice. He didn't know what he could do, but he knew what he couldn't do. He couldn't stand and do nothing. And as he stepped closer to the fire that morning, with the world watching and no one helping, something inside him came alive, a fire older, stronger, and deeper than the one consuming the garage. He didn't realize it yet, but this moment would change everything, not just for the men inside, but for an entire town that had forgotten what humanity looked like. Because sometimes, the loudest act of courage doesn't come from the young or the strong. It comes from the ones who've already lost everything, and still choose to care. The heat hit Elias before the flames did. It wrapped around him like a living thing, thick, suffocating, relentless. Smoke rolled down the street, black and bitter, but he kept walking. His boots crunched on broken glass. Sparks drifted through the air like burning snowflakes. Behind him, the crowd murmured, unsure whether to call him brave or foolish. No one followed. No one even tried. Inside the garage, engines exploded one after another, each blast sending a shudder through the ground. Elias could see figures through the smoke, shadows moving, coughing, stumbling. They were trapped. He found a side door, metal warped from the heat, and rammed it with his shoulder until it cracked open. The smell of burning rubber and gasoline filled his lungs. He coughed, but didn't stop. He wrapped his hand in his old flannel sleeve and pulled the door wider. The sound that came out wasn't just the fire, it was fear. Men yelling for help, the kind of sound that claws at your chest because it's pure, desperate survival. He spotted one of them, a big man, tattoos across his arms, face smeared with soot. Elias grabbed him by the jacket and dragged him toward the open air. They collapsed together on the gravel outside. The man gasped for breath. Elias didn't say a word. He just turned back toward the smoke. Again and again, he went in. By the third trip, the crowd had started filming. Not helping, filming. Some were laughing nervously, others whispering things like, "Look at that old fool," or "He's doing this for attention." But the camera lenses stayed steady, capturing every second, not out of admiration, but disbelief. No one expected a 70-year-old black man to walk into a burning building for a group of white bikers. Not in this town. Not after all the things said and done over the years. But Elias didn't care about color, or patches, or history. Fire didn't discriminate, and neither did he. He managed to pull out 3 men before the fire trucks finally arrived, sirens slicing through the chaos. Firefighters rushed in, pushing him aside, yelling that it was too dangerous. His face was covered in ash, his clothes singed, but his eyes were clear. That's when he saw it. A hand sticking out from beneath the collapsed beam inside. Someone still trapped. He shouted for help, but the firefighters had their orders: secure the perimeter. No one moved. So he went in one more time. The smoke was thicker now, the air unbreathable. He could barely see, but he followed the sound, the faint scraping of someone trying to move. He lifted the beam just enough for the man underneath to crawl out. A young mechanic, barely in his 20s. His skin was burned, but he was alive. By the time they stumbled outside, Elias collapsed beside him. The crowd cheered, not out of gratitude, but out of relief that it was over. Firefighters rushed to control the last of the blaze. Reporters started showing up, cameras flashing, microphones out. The town that hadn't lifted a finger now wanted to talk. Someone finally asked, "Who is he?" And no one knew. Within hours, social media was flooded with videos. Old man saves bikers from fire. Local hero risks life. But as the views climbed, so did the comments, and they weren't kind. Some called him stupid. Others said he must have been paid. A few even claimed he'd started the fire himself just to play hero. And when the police showed up the next morning, those whispers turned into something uglier. They questioned him, not about his injuries, not about what he'd seen, but about why he was there in the first place. Why he was near the Hells Angels garage so early. Elias sat on his porch, wrapped in a blanket, bandages on his hands. "I was trying to help," he said simply. But they didn't write that down. They wrote, "possible witness." Then, "possible suspect." The next day, the local paper ran the headline, "Investigation launched into suspicious fire, local man questioned." His name wasn't even mentioned, but everyone knew who they meant. The same people who had watched him risk his life now avoided his eyes in the grocery store. Some crossed the street when he walked by. Others whispered behind his back. The town needed someone to blame. And blaming a 70-year-old black man was easier than facing their own silence. At night, his phone rang with unknown numbers. No one spoke when he answered. Sometimes, he'd find tire tracks near his house that hadn't been there before. Once, someone threw a beer bottle through his front window, no note, no message, just a reminder. Meanwhile, the bikers he'd saved were recovering. One of them, the youngest, the mechanic named Kyle, came to see him. He brought a new blanket and some groceries. His face was scarred, his hands still wrapped in gauze. "Everyone's talking," he said quietly. "They think you did it." Elias didn't respond. He just looked at the broken glass still scattered on his porch. Kyle lowered his voice. "But I know you didn't. You saved my life." Elias nodded. "Then live it right," he said softly. Kyle promised he would, but promises don't stop hate. The investigation dragged on. No evidence, no arrests, just endless suspicion. Some said the fire was an accident. Others whispered it was a message, a warning to the bikers who had hired too many black mechanics, or taken in too many outsiders. Whatever the truth was, Elias had become the face of blame. Weeks passed. His workshop, the small shed where he used to fix bicycles for neighborhood kids, was vandalized. Spray paint across the door, "We don't need your kind here." The message was clear. But something unexpected started happening, too. The same videos that had mocked him began circulating again, this time shared by people from other towns, other states. "This man is a hero," they said. "He stood where no one else would." News outlets picked it up. His story spread far beyond the borders of his small, divided town. That's when the pressure shifted. The town couldn't ignore him anymore, not when the world was watching. Reporters came knocking. The mayor called him a symbol of courage. Local leaders suddenly wanted to honor him for his bravery and service. But the same neighbors who had called him a suspect just days before were now smiling for cameras beside him. It felt hollow. Because when the cameras turned off, nothing had changed. The same glances. The same whispers. The same invisible walls. Then, one night, his doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a group of men, the bikers he had saved. They stood there awkwardly, shifting their weight, unsure how to start. Kyle spoke first. "We heard what they've been saying. We're not letting them do this to you. Elias just looked at him. You don't owe me anything. We know, Kyle said. But maybe we owe ourselves something. They offered to rebuild his workshop. To fix what the town had broken. To stand with him, publicly, loudly, unapologetically. When they started clearing the debris the next morning, people watched again. But this time, there were no phones, no laughter, no whispers. Just silence. It was a strange sight, the Hell's Angels working side by side with an old black man. To some, it looked like defiance. To others, it looked like redemption. But not everyone liked what they saw. One afternoon, as Elias and Kyle were repairing the door, a police car pulled up. The officer, the same one who had questioned Elias after the fire, stepped out. Still fixing things that aren't yours, Turner, he said, voice flat. Elias didn't answer. He just kept hammering. The officer looked at Kyle. You boys really think this man's your savior? You should know better. Kyle straightened up. We know exactly who he is. The officer smirked. Yeah. That's what scares us. He left, but the message lingered. The town might have cameras watching now, but hatred didn't need an audience. It thrived in silence. As days passed, the tension grew heavier. Anonymous notes slipped under Elias's door. A cross burned one night on the edge of his property. Each act designed to remind him of his place, to push him back into the shadows he'd stepped out from. But Elias refused to retreat. He kept rebuilding. Kept showing up. Kept walking down the same streets that now whispered his name, sometimes in respect, sometimes in hate. And then, just when things began to feel almost calm, the truth surfaced. An old security camera from across the highway captured the start of the fire, a pickup truck pulling up behind the biker garage minutes before the flames erupted. The footage was blurry, but clear enough to show it wasn't Elias. It was someone else. Someone local. The police tried to downplay it, but word got out. Elias was innocent, completely. The town that had doubted him fell silent. No apologies came, no one knocked to say they were wrong. But something deeper happened instead, shame. People started avoiding his eyes for a different reason now. The same silence that once accused him now protected him, not out of kindness, but out of guilt. And in that quiet, something shifted in Elias too. He realized that what he had done that night, walking into the fire, had burned away more than a building. It had exposed the truth about everyone around him. He had seen who they really were. And deep down, they had too. By the time the story spread across the country, Elias Turner had already gone back to his old life, the same porch, the same coffee, the same quiet mornings. But nothing was truly the same anymore. Because now, every time he walked through town, people saw him. Some with respect. Some with resentment. But all with recognition. And for a man who had lived invisible for decades, that was something like justice, not perfect, not pure, but real. The night it all came to a head wasn't loud at first. It began the same as every other, the crickets humming, the distant echo of engines on the highway, and the faint rustle of wind brushing across Elias Turner's porch. He sat there, same old chair, same chipped mug of coffee in hand, thinking maybe, just maybe, things had finally quieted down. But peace has a way of fooling people right before it breaks. A low rumble of motorcycles cut through the dark. Headlights flared across the dirt road, 5 of them, no, 6, rolling slow, deliberate, surrounding his small house like predators circling prey. Elias watched, unflinching. He recognized the sound, but not the faces. These weren't the same bikers he'd saved. These were outsiders, men who carried the same insignia but none of the same hearts. Engines idled. Voices muttered. Boots hit the gravel. Old man, one shouted, his tone half taunt, half threat. You got a lot of people talking. Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said he'd heard enough of men like this for a lifetime. The leader stepped forward, tall, red bandana tied tight, cigarette hanging from his lips. You think you're some kind of hero? He sneered. Saving them? Making us look weak? Elias stayed still. He'd learned long ago that silence could be stronger than shouting. But the man didn't like silence. He kicked the wooden railing, splintering it. You don't get it, do you? He hissed. You messed with something that wasn't yours. Behind him, another biker poured gasoline along the edge of the property, laughing under his breath. The smell was sharp, dangerous, unmistakable. Elias rose slowly from his chair. You think this will fix anything? He said quietly. The man's eyes narrowed. This ain't about fixing. It's about reminding. He struck a match. For a moment, the world froze, the hiss of fire kissing the ground, the flicker of orange spreading through dry grass, crawling toward the porch like a living thing. Elias didn't run. He didn't beg. He just stared into the flames, and in that instant, every fire he'd ever seen came rushing back. The one that took his first shop, the one that took his father's house, the one that nearly took his life decades ago when hate wore uniforms instead of patches. He'd survived all of them. But this was different. This one wasn't about burning a building. It was about burning his dignity. He turned toward the men. You light it, he said calmly, and you'll have to live knowing you burned down the house of the man who saved your brothers. The leader laughed, flicking the match toward the ground. They ain't my brothers. The flame hit the trail of gasoline. It roared to life instantly, a wall of fire separating Elias from escape. The men backed away, smirking, satisfied. But something unexpected happened next. From down the road, the roar of other engines echoed, louder, faster, closer. Headlights cut through the darkness again. This time, it wasn't strangers. It was them, the same Hell's Angels he'd saved from the fire. Kyle was leading the way. They didn't stop to talk. They didn't stop to think. They charged in like a storm. The outsiders scattered, some trying to flee, others standing their ground, fists and chaos breaking out under the glare of the fire. Elias stood frozen between them, his house burning behind him, men fighting in front of him, the night alive with rage and heat and noise. Kyle reached him first. Elias. We've got to move. But Elias shook his head. No more running. He turned toward the flames licking the edge of his porch. Not again. Before Kyle could stop him, Elias grabbed a nearby bucket, filled it from the old pump, and threw it at the fire. It barely made a difference, but it was something. He went back for another, coughing, his eyes watering. Kyle grabbed him by the arm. You can't fight it alone. Elias looked at him. I never could. But someone has to start. That moment, that sentence, broke something open in Kyle. Without hesitation, he yelled to the others, get the water. Help him. And just like that, the men who had once been judged, mocked, and hated for who they were formed a human chain. Buckets, hoses, bare hands, whatever they could find. They fought back the fire together while the others called for help. The outsiders saw what was happening, and it shook them. The image was too powerful, too raw, men of every color, scarred, burned, bruised, fighting with the man they'd once been told to fear. One of the attackers shouted, "This ain't over," before speeding off into the night. But something in his voice sounded less like threat and more like defeat. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the worst was over. The porch was gone, half the roof too, but the house still stood. So did Elias. He was exhausted, coughing, trembling, barely able to stand, but he was alive. Kyle helped him sit down, wrapping a wet cloth around his shoulders. The firefighters rushed past, assessing damage, muttering about arson and insurance. Reporters would come again, cameras flashing, microphones searching for the next viral headline. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the sight. Men who once rode with separate colors now standing shoulder to shoulder, covered in soot, watching the last embers fade. As dawn broke, a faint orange glow spread across the horizon, not from fire this time, but from sunlight. Elias looked out over the smoky yard. Funny thing about fire, he murmured. It shows you what's worth saving. Kyle nodded, voice low. You saved us twice now. Elias smiled faintly. No, son. You saved yourselves. The firefighters called the scene safe, but the crowd had already gathered, neighbors again, same ones who'd stood watching weeks before. Only this time, their faces weren't smug or curious. They were quiet. Ashamed. Someone in the back whispered, "That man just won't stop walking into fire." Another replied, "Maybe that's what it takes." For a brief, fragile moment, the town felt something it hadn't in years, unity, or at least the beginning of it. But the story didn't end there. Later that day, the sheriff arrived. He looked at the damage, then at Elias, then at the bikers. His jaw tightened. "You brought this on yourself," he muttered. Kyle stepped forward. "You saying this man asked to have his house burned down?" The sheriff shrugged. "He stirred things up. People don't like that." Elias stood, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "You mean people don't like being reminded they still have hate in their hearts?" The sheriff glared. "Watch your words, old man." Elias didn't flinch. "I've watched too many men die because of silence. I'm done watching." The sheriff left without another word. But everyone who heard it, every neighbor, every firefighter, every reporter, carried those words with them. That was the real fire. The kind that couldn't be put out with water. Over the next few days, the footage spread again, not of the garage fire this time, but of the night his house burned. The images of bikers and an old man saving each other's lives became a symbol, a strange, powerful proof that humanity still existed in places no one expected to find it. Elias never asked for it. He didn't care for headlines or praise. But what he'd done, and what he'd endured, had become bigger than him. He'd started something he couldn't stop. Because the world loves a hero, but it needs a reminder that heroes don't always look the way people expect. Sometimes they're old. Sometimes they're tired. Sometimes they've been ignored their whole lives. But when the fire comes, they stand anyway. And that night, when the smoke cleared and the sirens faded, Elias sat once again in his chair, what was left of it, and watched the first morning light spill over the horizon. The wind carried the faint smell of ash, but also something new, something clean. He looked down at his burned hands, at the cracked skin, and whispered to himself, "They tried to burn me out, but they only proved I was still here." Then, faintly, the sound of engines again, the good kind this time. The same bikers rolling up the road, not to fight, not to save, but just to be there. To stand guard. And for the first time in a long time, Elias didn't feel alone. He looked at the rising sun, and a small, quiet smile spread across his face. The fires had taken so much, but they'd given him something too. Something most men spend their whole lives searching for, purpose. Because sometimes, it's not the fire that destroys you. It's the fear of standing in it. And Elias Turner, the old man everyone once overlooked, had walked through fire twice, and come out carrying the truth. And the world was finally starting to see it. When the smoke finally cleared, the once roaring fire was reduced to a skeleton of twisted steel and blackened ash. The Hells Angels garage, once their pride, their symbol of strength, was gone. But amidst the ruins stood the old black man, his hands blistered, his clothes soaked, his breath ragged. He had saved what little could be saved. For a long moment, there was silence. No cheers. No thank you. Just stunned faces, unsure how to process what they had just witnessed. The same men who had stood back and watched the flames dance were now face to face with the man who had done what they wouldn't. The man they had judged without knowing. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them, at their fear, their guilt, their confusion, and turned to walk away. But something in that silence shifted. One of the bikers, a younger member who had always carried himself with arrogance, took a step forward. His voice trembled as he said, "Sir, why'd you help us?" The old man stopped but didn't turn around. "Because fire doesn't care who you are," he said softly. "And neither should we." He kept walking. That night, the Hell's Angels gathered what was left of their pride and sat together, not to talk about revenge, or loss, or anger, but about what had just happened. They couldn't shake the image of that old man stepping into danger when everyone else turned away. A man they would have likely crossed the street to avoid. A man they might have judged by his skin before ever hearing his voice. The next day, word spread across town. People who had watched the fire, who had done nothing, now found themselves questioning their own silence. The videos posted online showed him walking through smoke, dragging out a fuel can, coughing through the fumes. It wasn't just a heroic act, it was a mirror. A reflection of what hate and indifference had turned people into. Days turned to weeks. The old man went back to his life quietly, never seeking recognition. But the ripples of that moment didn't fade. The Hell's Angels rebuilt their garage. Not bigger, not louder, but with something new painted above the entrance. It wasn't their logo this time. It was a mural of two hands, one black, one white, gripping each other tightly, with the words, "Fire doesn't choose sides." For many, it became a place of reflection. A symbol that even in the darkest flames, humanity can still rise, if someone dares to act. And though most never learned the old man's name, his story began to spread beyond that small town. News outlets covered it. Comment sections filled with debates, some praising his courage, others questioning why he'd risked his life for those who wouldn't have done the same for him. But maybe that was the point. Because racism isn't always about who throws the first stone, it's about who watches and stays silent. It's about the moments when people choose comfort over courage. That morning, one man made a choice that exposed the truth about everyone else. Months later, one of the Hell's Angels, now changed by that day, found the old man at a local diner. He sat beside him quietly and said, "You didn't just save our garage, you saved us from ourselves." The old man smiled faintly. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe you just finally saw the fire that's been burning a long time." He stood up, left a few dollars on the table, and walked out. And that line, "the fire that's been burning a long time," stayed with the biker. He realized the man hadn't just been talking about flames. He was talking about the hatred, the division, the quiet prejudice that had burned in their hearts for generations. That night, the biker posted something online. It wasn't a confession or a speech, just a photo of the rebuilt garage with a caption. "Sometimes it takes the one you judge the most, to show you what being human really means." The post went viral. People began sharing their own stories of kindness across color lines, small acts that reminded the world that decency isn't about skin, creed, or class. It's about choice. In the end, the fire that destroyed the Hell's Angels garage did something unexpected. It rebuilt something deeper. It exposed fear, burned away prejudice, and left behind a single truth that no one could ignore. Sometimes, the bravest hearts belong to those the world overlooks. And as the camera slowly pans over the rebuilt mural, the narrator's voice fades in. The fire was real. The fear was real. But so was the courage of one man who chose humanity over hate. Maybe we can't stop every flame, but we can choose how we respond when one begins. Because silence, too, is a kind of fire. And it burns deeper than we realize. So ask yourself, when the next fire starts, will you stand back and watch? Or will you step forward, even if no one else does? Fade to black.